Hello, my friends, Evolutionary Energy Arts family. So, guys, as we study our comparative mythology, history, religions, philosophies, it's just fascinating to see the interconnectedness that is there between so many different societies and how things have, shared common origins.
It is, and they just keep connecting the dots and they keep tying together over and over and over.
So, right here, we're looking at a very old depiction. Obviously, we have the serpent there. We have a goddess and a god seated right next to the tree of life. And so, this is about 5,000 years old. And there are so many of these ancient stories that have been told, and retold. And as we know, we've seen this horned god many, many times. And, here we see some other depictions. We see humans here, and this is a god because it's so much bigger. That's one of the ways we know. So, Inanna. Inanna is a very interesting deity, a goddess of both love and war, as we see the symbol here for Venus. So associated with the morning star and the evening star. Oh my, how you have fallen, oh evening star, right, or morning star, right, depending on your translation. So again, like we've talked so many times, if we only look at the Bible, we got just tiny little snippets. And so, many times people will say, well, you just got to read your Bible. And, well, it's a good place to start, but that's a start. That's not the whole story. That's a tiny little piece of the story. You have to go into your comparative mythology, otherwise you're missing the boat, and seeing where things came from. Because when you know the history of things, then everything changes. So we see Asherah, God's forgotten wife. I mean, I've done a video on this before. So those raised in the Judeo-Christian tradition may be surprised to learn that the god that we were told was singularly sacred once had a wife. How do we know? Well, Asherah figures prominently as the wife of El, the supreme god, and in a treasure trove of cuneiform texts found in the second millennium port city of Ugarit. This is in northern Syria for perhaps hundreds of years before Abraham migrated to what would have been later known as Israel. Asherah was revered as Atharat, Earth Mother, and fertility goddess. And in fact, Solomon had done dedications to Asherah. And so, this was something that was later on looked down at and changed. And so the tradition we have now is not the original tradition. That's the bottom line. It's been morphing and changing the whole time. And many times it's to suit the needs of those that are in charge and to hide some things, hide true origins, and also control a mindset. But we know this, we see this. Now, Asherah, Inanna, Astarte, Isis, in many lines of thinking, these are all the same being. These are really all the same being, just looked at from different people given different names to it. And we're going to see some evidence of that farther towards the end of this video in regards to some of the rituals that are done by secret societies as well as others, they're not so secret, that show that this is the same energy. These are basically the same stories being told and retold again. So very interesting when we look at that. So, El was the supreme god of the Canaanites. And as we know, if you guys have actually studied how the Bible was put together, you have the writings of the Elohists, you have the writings of the Yahwists, and then you have the priestly writings as well. So, unfortunately, many people are under the thought that Moses wrote the whole thing, or, as far as the Old Testament goes, or, that these were writings that were one singular entity. These were many different books that were put together. As we've said before, if you look at the Gospels that were in circulation in the first century church, there was over 200 Gospels in circulation in the first century church. And people were not of the same opinion as to the divinity of Christ and so many different major points. Those things only got hammered out after the First Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, when the Catholic Church was formed and the official doctrine was brought into being by Constantine the Great, who was a Roman emperor. And he was doing that to basically solidify his empire. As we know, he wasn't really the nicest guy because he put to death his first wife and first child. And he did that 1 year after the Council of Nicaea. So we have to recognize how, religion has been used to control the minds, the hearts of the people through fear, often. Fear of punishment, fear of judgment, fear of God, which, if we look at God as being ultimately love, there's no place for fear in love. And the opposite of love is fear. So it's good to go deep into details and see how things were really put together. So we see the ancient Israelites soon adopted Asherah and gave her Hebrew equivalent name of Asherah. And, when we look at it, these are the same beings. And now, when you look later on, Asherah becomes demonized by the church and turned into Astaroth, which is a demon. So, very interesting. However, Asherah, partner of Yahweh. So, who was Asherah to the ancient Israelites? And why is she so often found paired with Yahweh, the Hebrew God? Historians, archaeologists have pieced together Asherah's narratives and found large chunks of it interwoven in the artifacts from the region and in the scriptures of the Hebrew Bible itself. Evidence suggests that Asherah was observed in ancient Israel and Judea as early as the 12th century BC to a few decades before the fall of the southern kingdom of Judah, 587 to 588 BC, a time known as the pre-exilic period. In fact, the very notion of polytheism is inherent in the quest for Asherah. After all, Asherah's place in the pantheon is alongside Yahweh's, the supreme deity. And what cultures did was they would incorporate other people's gods into their system as they were being conquered and as they were conquering. And so we have seen that time and time again. And a lot of times the deities would absorb the titles of the other deities, and it actually absorbed the whole personality and the stories of other deities. And they were always in competition. Always, always, always. So, furthermore, many artifacts representing Asherah and her cult from the region belies the biblical prohibition against the creation of idols. So, how did they worship? And why did they prohibit it as well? That's an interesting part in the story. As we see, it's really fascinating to see this. And over here, did God have a wife? Scholar says that he did. The word Asherah was nearly edited out of the Bible, researcher concludes. And this is an Oxford scholar as well. But that was the bottom line. And you could see references to it. And then how do you explain Deuteronomy 32:8? Which talks about God being there at the head of the table in the council of the gods. Again, divine beings, which are showing their origins in the Sumerian tales of all the different deities. And again, they all get kind of interwoven. We see the story, since we know the original flood stories, the ones that the Bible pulls from come from Sumeria. And we see the originals, which really... There's Enlil, who wants the flood to wipe out man, and Enki, who wants to save man because he created man in the first place. In the Bible, they're put into being just one being, doing both. And that is why some scholars, when they study it, say that if you follow the Bible, and especially in the Old Testament, you're going to get whiplash because it seems like God is changing his mind all the time. Benevolent God, punishing God, that type of thing. But it's because there's more than one deity that they are talking about that's been consolidated down into one deity, consolidated down over time. And so Raphael Patai is the first historian back in 1967 to mention that the ancient Israelites worshiped both Yahweh and Asherah. And the theory has gained new prominence because of the research of Francesca Stavrakopoulou, who began her work in Oxford, now a senior lecturer at the Department of Theology and Religion. Well, we had lost for over 1900 years all the Gnostic texts, which were burned by the early church. And luckily, we found them in Nag Hammadi in Egypt. And so that gave us a much different light on early Christianity and early Christian thought. As really, when you look at the Gnostic texts, they go in line with much of the Eastern traditions, that the only way to reach God is to go within. And when you look at Christ, he tore apart the priesthood. And the priesthood, those that were the religious leaders of the time, they were not, in Christ's own eyes, doing things as they should, but instead more leading people astray, which has been the case for history, as we see. So much of what would empower people by finding that you could go within, you don't need any sort of church or power structure, was removed, because that took power away from the church, took power away from the kingship, it took power away from the authorities. And as we know, authorities are all about power. So, as we've found more and more of these ancient texts, and we see where these stories are based on, it's a much different picture that, we are able to see.
It is a much different picture. You really need to kind of know someone like Michael here who can take information from this book and that book and then tie it together for you.
Well, it's only through trying to study everything. That's the thing. You have to look at it from all different angles, because if you only look at it from one angle, you're totally blind. You're not seeing the big picture. So, again, Asherah's consort was El, and by him she was the mother of 70 gods. So she was a mother goddess who was worshipped through Syria and Palestine. And she was also frequently paired with Baal, who often took the place of El as Baal's consort as well. And you see, over time, everything got changed and wiped out. But these stories, they repeat time and time again. And we have Inanna and Dumuzi. And so perhaps this is the most ancient one we have right now, which is 5,000 years old. 5,000 years old minimum. And Inanna was the Sumerian goddess of love and fertility and war, known in Akkadian as Ishtar. Her husband was the shepherd king. Oh, shepherd. Where did we hear that before? Dumuzi, or Dumuzid, or Tammuz, who became a god at some point, possibly through his marriage to Inanna. So he was human, but became a god. So we could see the divine lovers, however, had a rocky relationship culminating in the scorned goddess condemning her husband to the underworld when he failed to mourn her death. The tale of a young hero or god who marries a powerful but vengeful goddess echoes the story of Jason and Medea, as this author's book shows. The trip that Jason makes to and from the solar kingdom of Colchis closely parallels Dumuzi's annual voyage across the waters of death and to and from the sun's underworld kingdom, just as the resurrection of Dumuzi at the hands of Inanna parallels Medea's rejuvenation of Jason and Aeson. So Ishtar's descent into Hades. So, we see here, this is probably the original story, as this is going back, 5,000 years easy. And yet, it has all the elements that we've seen from Mithras and the Mithraic elements as well as others. And we're going to, touch on that as well. So, this is fascinating. And I know, I remember a year or two ago, Rex had done a thing on Dumuzi, the original Christ, when you get down to it. And that's a question mark because, again, all these legends, stories, these myths, they still might be taken from something even older yet that we don't know.
Yeah, they might be. And because they haven't given us all the information, we only get what they choose for us to see.
So Inanna is the ancient Sumerian goddess of love, sensuality, fertility, procreation, also of war, and later became identified by the Akkadians and the Assyrians with the goddess Ishtar, and further with the Hittite Soxka, and also with the Phoenician Astarte, and the Greek Aphrodite, and then also, as we were talking about, the Canaanite Asherah. So interesting, associated with Venus, 8-pointed star. Pretty fascinating. There's tons and tons of writings in the myth about this as well. And, they date so far back beyond anything biblical. It's obvious where the biblical sources come from. These myths are far, far, far more ancient. And so this is a dying and resurrecting story that we have here. And here you see also the descent of Inanna into the underworld, a 5,500-year-old literary masterpiece. And so it was originally written in cuneiform, inscribed on clay tablets. It's in the form of a poem. It tells of the heroine's journey into the underworld to visit and challenge the power of her recently widowed sister, Ereshkigal. And the poem is thought to be imbued with meaning and symbolism, and various interpretations have been attached to it. So again, Inanna, Ishtar, it's all connected. Asherah, these are the same beings, and also Isis, when we look at it. Regarded as one of the most important deities of the Mesopotamian pantheon, known primarily as a goddess of sexual love, although she also has the reputation of being quite a goddess of war. And she is said to be the most complex Mesopotamian deity, as she possesses attributes that seem to contradict each other at times. So again, she could also be a condensation of more than one, entity, as that is what happens over time. And so, this is a really interesting story. It's thought to have been composed at some point in time between 3500 BC, and that's very ancient, and 1900 BC. And it could have even been created at an even earlier date. It has 415 lines, and by comparison, the Babylonian Ishtar's descent is told in 145 lines. It's been suggested that difference was due to the influence of patriarchy, which diminished the power and importance of the goddess during the second millennium BC. And we've seen that. There was definitely a tendency to go away from the balance, because also Inanna, Ishtar, Asherah, this is also thought to be the Shekinah, and it's that divine feminine energy, as ultimately many believe all goddesses are really one goddess, again. So the descent of Inanna begins with the following lines. From the great heaven she set her mind on the great below. From the great heaven the goddess set her mind on the great below. From the great heaven Inanna set her mind on the great below. My mistress abandoned heaven, abandoned earth, and descended to the underworld. She abandoned heaven, abandoned earth, and descended to the underworld. One explanation for her interest in the underworld is that she hopes to extend her power into that realm, whose queen is her sister, Ereshkigal. And when she arrives at the gates of the underworld, Inanna informs the gatekeeper, Neti, that she has come to witness the funeral rites of Gugalana, the bull of heaven. Interesting, too, because we've seen the bull of heaven being slaughtered by Mithras, right? And then the bull is Taurus, the age of Taurus. And then the Mithraic age is the age of the ram. And the ram could also be, taken to be Mars, Ares, god of war. So it's just interesting how all these things tie together as we see the procession. The stories are retold in a new way, but it's the same stories that are constantly being retold. And in the Piscean age, then we know, the stories that come from that as well. And now we're heading into the Aquarian age. So when Ereshkigal receives this news, she is not all pleased and ordered that the 7 gates of the underworld be bolted against her sister. And Inanna is only allowed to pass 1 gate at a time, and before each gate she is required to remove a piece of her royal garment. By the time, Cindy's mouth just opened like, where are we going with this story?
I know, right?
By the time Inanna reaches the throne room of Ereshkigal, she has been stripped naked and was powerless. Ereshkigal overpowered her sister, who was turned into a corpse and hung on a hook. Prior to entering the underworld, Inanna had instructed her servant, Ninshubur, on how to come to her aid should she fail to return at the expected time. This Ninshubur went to the god Enki, Inanna's father, and we know that name, for help. While Inanna was successfully revived by the servants sent by her father, she is unable to leave the underworld as easily as she had entered it, as a substitute had to be found, and Enki's servants tried to take several of Inanna's followers. Through the goddess's though the goddess stops them from doing so, as they were all mourning for her supposed death. In the end, Inanna encounters Dumuzi, her husband, who is clearly not in mourning, as he was clothed in a magnificent garment, seated magnificently on a throne. This infuriated Inanna, who ordered him to be seized. Dumuzi prays to Uru, which is the sun god, to save him, and is transformed into a snake. Interesting. Nevertheless, he is captured in his attempt to escape and brought to the underworld. Inanna, Dumuzi's sister, volunteers to be her brother's substitute, and in the end it was decided that Dumuzi and his sister would each spend half of the year in the underworld. Like the Greek myth of Persephone and Demeter, this event is used to explain the changing of the seasons. So, yeah, there you have it from that point of view. Fascinating stories. And so, Dumuzi, his name means true son, faithful son, living son, or risen son. He is a shepherd and a fisherman. His wife is associated with Venus, which is linked to an early falling dying god that Jerusalem is named after. And he is attacked while under a great apple tree, just as Jesus was said to have been crucified on the tree of life in Eden. It's interesting stuff. He spends winter with the queen of the netherworld and spring with the fertility goddess. The festival of his death is at the same time as the Jewish festival of booths, and the festival of resurrection is marked by his name on the Hebrew calendar. He is resurrected by women ritually mourning his death, and he is resurrected from beneath the tree of life. A goddess associated with his wife is worshipped using sacramental tree pole, and again that's Asherah poles. And he has a sacramental ritual of bread and water, not wine, though his sister is named after wine. So pretty interesting there. His father created Eden, ate a forbidden fruit, was healed by a rib goddess, created man out of clay, and gave Dumuzi's wife the knowledge of good and evil. So we can see like the origin of some of these stories. And then, this is another on the courtship of Inanna and Dumuzi. This is a PDF basically for you guys. More links to look and see. I mean, this is well documented. And again, this is probably 5,500 years old. And then we have Osiris, the outstanding story of Osiris, his myth, symbols, and significance in ancient Egypt. The green-skinned god of the underworld. Interesting, isn't that? And, again, it's a retelling of the stories. And many of you are very familiar with Osiris, who was chopped up by his brother in opposition, Seth. And Isis rescued everything except for one very important little piece that went missing. And then basically his son ends up taking over the role of rulership, as Osiris is, a dying and resurrection god again. So when you look at this is the lesser hexagram ritual, but lesser banishing ritual, the hexagram, which was created by the Golden Dawn. And, this is an interesting ritual because you have all the mythologies wrapped up in one, basically, in one ritual here. And any thoughts there, Cindy?
Well, this is really good stuff. I think everyone should know how to do this stuff, at least understand it.
Well, understand like the origins. So one of them, when you're doing this ritual, the first thing you do is the lesser banishing ritual, the pentagram, which gets rid of any sort of etheric energies that are out there, lower astral energies, discarnate spirits. It clears a room, and it's a very effective ritual. And I have a video on that. I have a video on this that go through that. Both of those are on EEARTS. But the part I wanted to point out to is that it draws on Christ because you have the analysis of the keyword, which is basically the letters INRI. So these were what were written on the placard and placed as a sign over the body of Christ on the cross. And their abbreviation for the phrase, Jesus Nazarenvas Rex Ad Vorum, which basically means Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, which many obviously know this. So it's interesting that you're calling on Christ's energy. And then we also do the name of God, which is Yod He Vohe, signified by Yod, Nun, Resh, and Yod. And you draw this in the air, etheric, using your intention. And then there's another part of it which brings up the story of Isis and Osiris. And there's different postures you use to represent Osiris and Isis as well. And then you also use EAO, which IAO or EAO is thought to signify basically the demiurge and the demiurge's energies. And so, it's curious that this is using Egyptian symbology, specifically also, the myth of Osiris in conjunction with Christ, because to these beings, these people that put this together, these energies are all the same. And so whether we're talking about, the Christ energy, the Osiris energy, or Dumuzi, whether we're saying Asherah, Isis, Astarte, Inanna, it's the same energies that we're tapping into. So I just thought I'd bring that up to give you a point of reference, and you might find it very interesting.
It is interesting. When you draw things in the ether, remember, we're made of light, so that thing really is going into the ether. And it's just so interesting how we're not taught these things, how we can affect the ether with our energy and intention.
And, besides doing these comparative religious studies, I've studied all different types of magic systems, including chaos magic, low magic, high magic, ceremonial magic, and have experienced the power and energy that comes through with the different ones. It doesn't matter if Isis or Osiris or Dumuzi or Inanna, it doesn't really matter if any of these entities ever really lived, because people believe in something and believe that there's power there, then there's power there. And if you have hundreds of thousands, hundreds of millions, or even 1 billion people that believe that an entity exists and is powerful, then just by calling on that name, tapping into that energy flow, there's a lot of power behind it. Doesn't matter if the being ever really lived. Just when you have all these people believing it so, then it is.
It definitely is. Our energy matters. So where the energy goes, attention flows, or is that backwards? Something like that.
Where the intention is, then the energy will flow.
Yes.
So in knowing that there's power in something, it makes it so. And when you have more than one person doing that, then it's increasing it. And, at one time, Isis was the most worshipped goddess in the world. And so there's tremendous power in the name of Isis, as is the same with any of these beings. There's tremendous power still there. And it doesn't matter, because everything is energy. Everything is energy. Everything is consciousness. And energy can't be created or destroyed. It just changes forms. It can be utilized. It can be tapped into. And that's what we do when we do these type of rituals. We're tapping into those energies. And if you get sensitive enough and you've done these rituals and explore through your meditation, then you could sense when things are really congruent, and when you're really tapping into the same sort of energy. It might have a slightly different flavor. Yeah, like if you go and you get a pizza and it's a Greek pizza, it's slightly different than your traditional pizza. And then if you have a Mexican pizza, it's still, the same components for the most part, but a little bit different seasoning, so to speak.
Yeah, everything's just all different but the same.
So my friends, I want to thank you for your support on Ko-Fi and Patreon. You guys keep us afloat. As always, God bless, stay safe, and namaste.
Namaste.